Hi, I'm BJ, and this is the Arcane Alienist Podcast. Well, hello out there, everybody. It's been a while since I did an episode, a solo episode. I've been on a couple episodes, I think, of the Geomologist recently, and we did a Cerebrivore last week after North Texas RPG Con. Be sure and check those out. But I have not done a solo podcast in a while. Hopefully, we'll get back to it a little bit. I've just been really busy with real life stuff. I do want to eventually go back to do a second edition of the solo play for Black Sword Hack. I really enjoyed doing that, and so I've got some ideas. I just need to make some time to sit down and do some solo play and take notes and then uh, write everything up. But in the meantime, here's a thought I had, and I thought I would just discuss it a little bit. And I'm inspired by a couple of things. One, when I was at North Texas RPG Con, I got to play in a Swords and Wizardry dungeon crawl with Matt Finch, the guy behind Swords and Wizardry, and the guy who kind of helped launch the OSR with his primer on old school gaming as sort of a response to the third edition D&D uh, paradigm shift that came with third edition. Um, and so all that is to say, I really enjoyed it. What Matt does is he has a kind of a mega dungeon that he runs uh, at cons, and if you've played before, you might remember a little bit, but the dungeon changes a little bit. So some things might be the same, but some things might be different. You know, if you've played around or you've visited before, you have some foreknowledge that can come into play, but you're not guaranteed that everything's exactly the same. So there's still some risk involved. And the other thing is, whatever character you end up with at the end, you know, if you haven't played before, you roll up a new character, and if it dies, you roll up a replacement and jump back in the game. But at the end, you know, your surviving character, assuming you've got one way, whether it's the one you started the session with or a replacement that came in, it can come back and keep the treasure and the XP it gained and it leveled up, and then you can play again next time. So I hopefully will get into another one of his games, if not sooner somewhere else. Maybe again this time next year at the next North Texas RPG Con, and get to bring my character back. Anyway, what I wound up rolling up was a halfling thief. I made him a fighter thief with the multi-classing rules from Swords and Wizardry. And then about two-thirds through the session, realized that I had misread the multi-classing rules and that halflings weren't allowed to multi-class. I had just mistakenly assumed that it was like AD&D. But Matt was kind enough to say, well, you know, we'll just treat him like he's an atypical halfling. No problem. Um, and so I really enjoyed playing this character, and but he did nearly die. He got taken out and was saved at the last minute by one of the other players' clerics as we were fighting a bunch of fire beetles in a room full of fire beaters in the dungeon. So my character's name is Danric Rumblefeet, and I just randomly generated a halfling name off the online fantasy character name generator that you can easily find by googling that. Uh, but immediately when he survived that encounter with the fire beetles, I gave him the epithet Beetlebane. So his name is Danric Beetlebane Rumblefeet as of that adventure. Jokingly, because he didn't actually kill a beetle, he almost died at the hands of a beetle. Uh, but to me, he was sort of a blank slate. He was like a lot of times when you're playing with kind of OD&D or some variant of it, he was more of a pawn to move around the board with some skills and equipment. But the more I moved around, the more I started thinking a little bit about what's this character like, what's his motivation, what would he be like to role play him in a little more depth. Even though this was just sort of a kind of beer and pretzel style dungeon crawl. And then Beetlebane, now he's got a story to tell, whether he tells the truth or whether he tells an embellished version where he was a little more heroic and successful than actual his actual uh, than actually happened. And it got me thinking about how when I play a character, a lot of times I kind of push back on creating any sort of backstory. And if the game master wants one, sometimes I don't have a lot to say, and I may have questions about the campaign setting or the type of adventures we're going to be running to try to come up with something. But I prefer to sort of figure out who that character is as I play them, and I want their backstory to kind of make sense with the world that I'm playing it in, and I, but I also I just need to take the character out for a test drive. Not only I can decide what class and ancestry or species I want to play, and put a background in there, and a little bit of a sketch maybe, but I don't know what their personality is, and I don't always know exactly what their background, complete life story might look like. And I it's there've been a rarely do I have I felt pressure to do more than I'm comfortable, but I have been in a couple of games over the years where the the game master is wanting more, and I'm like, well, I don't have more. I'll have to figure it out, as we go. And I know Daniel Norton of Bandits Keep has talked about this as well. He needs to play his character a little bit to figure out who he feels like they are, even though he might have something of an image from a little bit of it from the start. Uh, but if you listen to, there's been some really good episodes of Role Play Rescue. I'll link that where Che Webster has Anthony Boyd, no relation, on, and they're talking about they did some stuff on you know our role playing games, storytelling games, and then the most recent one, this last one was about the emergence of player character as a protagonist. Where in original D&D and early role playing games, they were probably just a collection of stats and gear used to kind of use as a pawn to navigate the game and the dungeon, but very quickly, as they trace over the course of role playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, and other role playing games, you see kind of where we're headed in the direction of player characters as fully realized, people, fictional people, but as a separate personality for you to inhabit and to maybe try to act according to their motivations, their personality, their life story, things like that. So you get to the dreaded, and sort of it's kind of an exaggeration when we say the 30-page character backstory. But and some games want for that. Some players like to do that. Some game masters want that. Some don't. And I'll talk about that a little more as we get into this. But between that kind of experience, and I think Anthony reflected this in the most recent episode of Role Play Rescue when he talked about sometimes you make a character and it just clicks who this character is. Uh, and you can imagine that even in original Dungeons and Dragons, if that wasn't the intention, that's immediately what a lot of people did. Some people don't, and so some people enjoy just sort of you know what they were talking about in the context of also PCs becoming more survivable as time went on, because people once they kind of get in their head who this character is, they kind of get attached to him, and that's normal. There's no problem with that. And I really appreciate how Che and Anthony in that discussion didn't take sides on how attached you should be to a character, or whether a character is something to role play, fully with a complete life story, or whether it is just a rough thumbnail sketch of a character, like you would have had early on in D and D and other kinds of old school or original role playing games. But I know Che and Anthony are both real big into immersion as part of their role playing experience, getting into a flow. And they made a really good point about our role playing games, story creation games, because right now they are very much billed as storytelling games. That's the buzzword, and most modern role playing games will tell you this is a game where you sit around with your friends and create a story. Versus our role playing games, a game that generates a story. That's my term. Is it a story? Are we talking about story creation, or as I would say, story generation? To me, a game about creating a story is going to have rules that ensure that you get a fully developed narrative that makes logical sense, internal sense. It's a satisfying narrative, a story that comes out the end. My use of the sword hack, I did that. I did it to create a story. But I'd like to point out there that the story emerged from the dice rolls and my reactions to the dice. Uh, it was my decision to use it to tell a story, which the book encourages you to for the solo play version of it. Anyway, maybe not the standard sort of group role playing game, but certainly for the solo play. But even then, I didn't have to use that to create a narrative. I could have just done that to just sort of solo play a you know a typical more kind of adventure role playing game. I chose to convert it to a narrative, and if you'll notice back in those episodes, I would describe it a little more in abstract the die rolls and the general results, and then I would on the second pass I would have to turn that into an actual more meaningful type of short story. Had to fill in scenery details, flesh out personalities of NPCs sometimes, uh, uh, expand the dialogue, and sort of craft that into now here's a more narrative explanation of how these events might put together in a meaningful way. But I don't have to do that. I was just choosing to do it. And I guess the point to make there, and I think the point that Che and Anthony were making, and I've heard years ago Matt Colville on his YouTube channel talk about his opinion that role playing games are not storytelling games, they're not story generating games, or they're not story creating games. The story is what you tell amongst yourselves after the event. And you can do that of any group activity. We can tell a story about what happened when we all went out, uh, and got a drink together. We can tell a story about, hey, you can sit around with your high school buddies and talk, hey, remember that? Remember the big game? The big foot. It was the district championship football game, and remember when caught that pass, or when you made that tackle, and remember when we thought we were going to lose and we came back from behind and won. Any activity you share with other people, you can go back later and tell a story about it. Just like Danrick will go back and tell a story about his experience in the dungeon with the fire beetles. But is that really what happened, or is that his interpretation of what happened? So to me, a role playing game generates a story. It doesn't. It's the point, because the point is not to create a story. The point is to enjoy an activity with your friends and play a game. The story is an epiphenomenon that emerges, and I guess that's the word I really want to focus on here in this episode is the emergent narrative that comes out of just rolling the dice and reacting to the scenarios and the events that unfold, and then later you have a story of your experiences going through that. But you can have a very boring, narratively, a very boring and narratively unsatisfying session of a role playing game where nothing interesting happens. It's just sort of a waypoint onto something hopefully more interesting next time. So you don't always get a complete, satisfactory story out of every instance of playing a role playing game. Um, so just something to think about. Uh, I'm very interested in this idea though of role playing games giving us an emergent, unscripted experience. So, and you can't always do that. Obviously, there's also a lot of fun you can have with semi-scripted adventures. It's not always, railroading is not always bad. I think even a good sandbox has things in it that are going on uh, independently of the players that don't. It takes a player choosing to interact with them to change that. If you think of, and I think I mentioned this before, the television show Westworld really goes into this. Not so much. I don't know if the original movie does so much, but certainly the particularly the first season of Westworld, you see they've created this basically live action park where you can live action role play as people in the old west, right? And the androids play out their characters. But if you don't have any visitors to the park, the androids just start at sort of 0 hour, and they have a thing they will do unless a human visitor comes in, and basically a player comes in and interacts with them, and that diverts the course of events based on what the visitors to the park, how they choose to interact with the unfolding story, and they can take it off in all kinds of different directions. And at some point, the visitors leave the park, and those story arcs resolve one way or the other, and then we set back to 0 hour and it starts over. Uh, and I think that even a good sandbox does that. Is it helps to have those sort of things that are playing out, maybe that the game master has set up, and it still leaves rooms for an emergent type of experience. We see, again, as things kind of veer off in different directions based on what the players choose to do or choose not to do. And the world might seem a little realer when the NPCs and the factions have their own motives, their own plots, and it's not a railroad as long as the players can choose to interact with them, um, up to including just deciding not to interact with it. But that might come back to bite you in the butt later if you choose to ignore something that's kind of out there that maybe is a brewing problem. Well, we don't want to get involved in that, but it might get worse, and you wind up regretting not getting involved with that. But that's that dynamic interaction between the players and the GM running the world and the NPCs in the world. But again, you get an emergent, not fully scripted kind of experience. Um, that said, the type of emergent play I'd like to explore more, and maybe be interested to get thoughts, you can leave me messages. There's ways to contact me, or if this is you're watching this on YouTube, just put a comment on the YouTube video. I'd really like to explore uh, a type of emergent play that would be having the game space procedurally generated right in front of you. That may not lend itself to the type of immersion that Che and Anthony are describing because the rules are very upfront. There are roles and things on tables kind of right there in front for everybody to be aware of. So it wouldn't be that kind of immersion, but it might be fun and to see what can emerge in this way. So what I'm thinking of would you might use one or more tools to create, say, a wilderness to explore, and then somewhere within that wilderness area, there's the entrance to a dungeon, and then you would explore the dungeon procedurally. I've got a book called Sandbox Generator. Um, this is by uh, Atelier Clandestine. Uh, Copyright 2023. I think I got this as a print on demand off Drive Through RPG, so you get the PDF and you can get it in print on demand. But it's got a simplified, pretty straightforward way to create. I think I've referenced this before. Some ways to procedurally generate hexes. Uh, one hex and then the surrounding hexes uh, to create an ever expanding geographical area. So you could use that and just roll the hexes as people sort of approach them for an area. I've also got, and there are any number of random ways to generate dungeons procedurally, but I've got a couple different types of decks of cards where you shuffle the deck and then it draws out the dungeon rooms, and they've been designs where you're never gonna, you know, it will eventually create a complete dungeon with uh, you know. Uh, Depending on, you can take cards in and out, and if you only want one entrance, or if you want multiple entrances and exits to the dungeon. So you're doing something like that, and have the players sit and either maybe even be involved in rolling the dice, and then the encounters are random based on either tables from, the whatever encounter tables might the ones that come standard in like the Dungeon Master's Guide or the rule books for whatever game you might be using. Or you could make your own custom random tables to sort of curate, so it's not quite as swingy and not as wild. You can focus in on a central theme. So if this is a dungeon, completely haunted by the undead, you could make sure your encounters only involve things related to undead. Or if it's the lair of a goblin, faction, and make sure you've only got goblinoids or maybe creatures that would make sense to be allied uh, there with goblins in their lair. Uh, but uh, you would be generating this area and play it out, and then uh, adjust it as so you could do this as lonely fun, and just do it as a solo play. But maybe also one way to do that, or I could think of doing it. I think about how I might do it is do it as lonely fun, but keep good notes, and then if anything doesn't really seem to work out, maybe make adjustments, and then eventually then run it for players. Go back to the beginning and run it from the start for players. That might be so in that way the solo play would be kind of a play test. Might be good for maybe one or two sessions, a one shot. It might work well, say at a convention. where for a lot of times conventions will give you a 4-hour block for a game. So for the first half, we're going to do a little bit of a hex crawl and try to locate the entrance to the dungeon, and then for the second half, we're going to do a dungeon crawl and use these tools to procedurally generate these with the players involved. So what do you think about that? I'd be interested to hear what people think about that. Would you enjoy doing that? Would you enjoy being part of rolling the dice and seeing what emerges, or would you want the DM to have sort of rolled it all out ahead of time, or create, or at least maybe not the random encounters, but sort of worked it all out so that we've got a map and you've just got to reveal the areas as you explore it, and let the dungeon master use the deck or the sandbox generator or whatnot, as part of prep. But let me know what you think about that. The other thing I wanted to talk to, maybe transition to back to characters, and the idea of characters as a protagonist versus just a pawn to be used in the game. As I said, I think Anthony and Shay did a good job of tracking the changing approach to PCs over the years without making any value judgments. However you want to play is up to you. But what they did hit on, like as I mentioned before, was the idea that it is kind of normal to kind of get attached to your character. Um, and maybe not for everyone, but for enough people that I think a lot of us would like a fighting chance to have an adventure, or at least the bulk of an adventure, before we have to roll up a replacement character. And one of the reasons I tend to bounce off Rollmaster uh, is because the amount of time it takes to create a character and then to manage a character outside of play as you level up and add. It's just it's not worth it to me to spend over an hour only to have a game that can kill the character outright 10 minutes into the session versus something like original D&D or BX where hey, if that happens, I just need about 5 or 10 minutes and I'll be back with a character that can jump right in as soon as it's feasible, right? I mean, and that's technically not usually what happens in Rollmaster, but it can, and it does, and I've seen it happen. So, anyway, I'm kind of digressing here. Where I'm going with this is the idea of that again, that much maligned, elaborate backstory, um, where the game becomes about having to have a consistent and satisfying character arc, and not just exploring the world to see what happens. Um, and again, that's an okay style for if you enjoy that. My attitude has always been, even if that helps you get into the headspace of your character to play him better, that's fine. And if you share some of that information with me, I might try to work in references to it. But it's really hard to build an entire adventure around 4 to 6 characters with elaborate backstories, particularly if we've said we're going to play kind of a pre-published adventure. If we're going to do, um, particularly some of these modern ones, which already have this sort of series of events and sort of things you're supposed to latch on to. And to me, it seems like it's better to have, and again, this is my opinion, better to have a character that's going to fit the type of adventure we're going on, and not one where we've got everybody's got to bend what they're doing around uh, you know your character. So again, if that backstory helps you fit into what's going on, that's great. And things like Pathfinder. Uh, Adventure Paths oftentimes will have a little source book, like a gazetteer or something, for players to look at and consider what kind of characters fit best for that adventure, so you can get some of that going on. So it's not an all or none kind of thing, right? Um, but what made me think when I said, okay, now I've got a little fact about Danric that I can share. It's something else that sort of occurred to me kind of as we had been playing him for about a half an hour. I think he has an eye patch. He doesn't have a missing eye. It's just a prop. And if you watch him carefully enough as one of his companions, you'll see him like lifting his eye patch so he can actually look around with his full vision, and then he'll slip it back down. So it's just purely for looks. He doesn't actually need it. Um, if you're wondering where I stole that, if you've got kids, there's a the Octonauts. It started off as a series of kid books, and then they did an animated series. And it's hey, I'm not gonna lie to you. If you're an adult, it's a fun show to watch even without the kids. So it's about these little anthropomorphic animals who have a submarine and they rescue they do research and rescue sea life. Nah, but one of the characters, Quasi the cat, he has an eye patch. And you frequently see him lift his eye patch up so he can look around. He obviously he's got both his eyes. It's pretty funny, but that's where I got the idea. He's kind of the mischief maker of the group. Um. Anyway, how'd I get off on Octonauts? Oh well, never mind. Uh. But here's an idea of just doling out facts. You know, as they come to you. They're not in play now. Now we can sort of put them into play. And you know, Fate does that, and Fate is much more of a storytelling kind of game where you create aspects for your character, and you start out with a few of them. You're encouraged to write them on index cards, and you can add more at different points later. Or you can change things about your character. But where this kind of all congealed in my head was one of my favorite actual play podcasts is a comedy podcast called Dungeons and Daddies, where they the first two seasons they played 5e D&D. Now right this season currently they're playing Call of Cthulhu, and they play loose with the rules. Because it is more of a comedy entertainment podcast, not a pure role playing con. So they do have backstories and more elaborate descriptions of their characters. Also because they're all writers and actors and performers in Hollywood, that sort of play style probably comes a little more naturally to them. It's also very funny if you haven't checked it out. It's certainly an R-rated podcast, but what they do in Dungeons and Daddies is at the beginning of every episode, as the cast sort of introducing themselves and who they play, they have a fact about their character. And in the first season, they called them dad facts because the characters are all fathers looking for their sons who had gone missing in the Forgotten Realms. Fathers from our world, by the way, they get transported to the Forgotten Realms and searching for their lost sons. But sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're interesting, sometimes they're silly, sometimes they are just random backstory things that are just kind of interesting, and sometimes they apply to the game. You know, it could be something from my distant past or something that, well, after our last adventure, this is what this character now thinks or believes or how they behave differently. But I wonder about doing that as a way to let your backstory emerge. So maybe you just start off with a real basic thumbnail sketch of your character. Um, or you could write the big backstory, but keep it to yourself, whichever you prefer. And then there could be times each session, either at the beginning of the session, or maybe whenever you're taking a rest, and so you're at a time where the party's gathered around the campfire, or they're sitting in an inn after they've come in off the road at the end of an adventure, um, and just role play out a brief moment where okay, everybody share something about their character, a fact that the other characters don't know about them. Um, and you get to kind of decide, well, is that something that you're actually saying, hey guys, I just thought of this, or did you know this, or is it just something that you could say, well, I think everybody would have realized by now. They would have caught on that my character doesn't like this, or they're highly motivated by that, or they've got a thing about this, that, or the other. So it might provide that balance, I think, between having the big backstory up front or being able to sort of create it as you go, and the pressure is off. You know, you've really only got to come up with something every so often. Um, and it doesn't have to be super elaborate. It can be simple, or it can be a little more detailed. But I kind of wonder about that. So that's that again. Let me know what you think about that. Could you have an emergent sort of character backstory that sort of comes out? And of course, you'd have to cap it. You know, I have to say, hey, we're only going to do this so many times before we stop doing it. Um, or maybe not. Maybe you do it for the entire. Even if you're going from level 1 to 20. Maybe so. Anyway, I have gone on long enough. Let me know what you think about those things. All the ways to contact me, either with a voicemail, an email, or as like I said, if when this hits on YouTube, just put a comment on the YouTube video if you want. But so that's it for now. I don't, hopefully I'll get back sooner than later. But until then, wherever you are out there, take care of yourself and make someone happy today. See you later. Thanks for listening to the Arcane Alienist podcast. The music you're hearing is Come and Get It by Scott Holmes Music. The cover art is by Dave Bone. Be sure to check out his stuff at ironseer.com. You can leave me a message. I have my SpeakPipe account linked to the show description. You can also send me an email at arcane.alienist@gmail.com. Just embed a voice memo, or I'll just read the text to your email during a future episode. Once again, thanks so much for listening.